Now, I don't really remember too much from what my friends had told me, but this happened to a classmate that used to be in my English class. His name was Brandon, and this took place when he was about maybe 5 or 6 years old. He and his family lived on a rural side of the place where I grew up in. However, to be fair, it wasn't really the safest or anything like that. Nothing has really happened to him until this night had happened. Now, it was around Easter weekend, and that's when basically his family was coming to stay with him, which was his grandparents. His grandparents decided to spend at least a few nights to help get Easter dinner and stuff ready. However, Brandon, along with his family, were pretty much just decorating fake eggs, aka hard boiled eggs. His younger sister was about maybe 2.5 at the time of the story. They were basically making eggs and even having a great time with the grandparents when, of course, it was bedtime and his mom had said that the Easter Bunny will come if he goes to bed. Brandon decides to head upstairs to bed as he really wanted Ned to get Easter eggs and stuff from the Easter Bunny. However, it wasn't until a couple hours after sleeping in the night, Brandon all of a sudden woke up. As soon as he woke up, he ends up looking around and decides to go downstairs. When he heard something, it sounded like someone was knocking on the door. Obviously, he couldn't really tell what was going on or what was happening, but he ends up looking around, thinking that there could be something or someone out there. He looks around, but of course, when he goes downstairs, he sees that there was a person looking through from the window. Why was the person looking through the window was anybody's question. Basically, what was going on was that he was looking through the window, and it became really apparent that this was no Easter Bunny. In his mind, he thought it might have been the Easter Bunny, but judging by the fact that this guy was looking through the window, was obviously no Easter Bunny. He obviously didn't even know if this man ever saw him, but he started knocking on the door. Well, the window of the door. He goes over to the door and the man asks him to let him in. However, Brandon didn't even recognize this man and he didn't even know who he was. He went back upstairs and he told his mom and dad. Of course, the parents are freaked out while the dad goes downstairs. The mom keeps him in the bedroom with her, and they end up calling the police. After a while, they were stuck upstairs for quite a bit until the police arrived. When the police arrived, they eventually arrested the man. And of course, Brandon was told to stay in the bedroom while his mom goes downstairs to see what was going on. When his mom went downstairs, he obviously didn't even understand what they were going on, but he obviously had a feeling that the police were talking with his parents about what had happened and stuff like that. It wasn't until a couple years later when the conversation was brought up again at the dinner table. Brandon had asked his mom what had happened that day, and his mom said, and I quote, "There basically was someone who was trying to look into breaking in the house. They mainly were looking for ways to get in and were hoping when they saw Brandon, he was hoping that Brandon would let him in. But Brandon did the smart thing and not let him in. Instead, he goes up and tells his mom and dad that there was someone out there." To this day, it still really frightens him to this day that, of course, there was someone out there was obviously trying to look around and do God knows what. What was this man even doing and why he was there? Brandon didn't even want to know. Of course, this really frightened him to this day, and he still wonders to this day what would have happened to them if he had let that man in. Of course, the grandparents had suggested getting security cameras, and that's what his parents did, was they went and go get security cameras. Nothing like that has ever happened again, but of course, This man was wanted for breaking in houses and stealing jewelry and stuff like that. He was arrested, and of course, he was in jail for a long time. Brandon hoped that this guy had stayed in jail for a long time and never come out. Obviously, what was this guy even thinking of doing was obviously a question that he ever wondered. Every now and then, he would just get maybe some sort of PTSD from it, and of course, he gets any questions from it. But still to this day, he even wonders what was this person even thinking of doing. It really frightens him to this day. Every time he thinks of Easter, he thinks about what would have happened to him if he had even let that guy in. What would his parents have done then? That was something that still frightens him to this day. So this was about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and it was just around the time before the global pandemic. It was Easter of 2019, and this actually happened to one of my friends. I'm gonna call my friend at the time. His name was Thomas. Thomas basically was living with his girlfriend at the time, as they had been out of college for at least a few years and were planning on getting married soon. Thomas and his girlfriend lived at a half-decent house for a half-decent price. Now, I think they lived somewhere in Utah. While they were living in Utah for at least a few years, they basically always celebrated good holidays together. However, one day in Easter was when something went terribly, really messed up. So Thomas and his girlfriend were pretty much sleeping on Good Friday morning. It was around 3 in the morning when all of a sudden Thomas gets a knock on the door. Now Thomas goes over to the door from downstairs and he opens it to reveal that there was no one there. It was strange, so he thought that maybe it was some teenagers ding-dong ditching people, as they had gotten a lot of teenagers doing that, as they lived not too far from a high school. Obviously, Thomas was a little annoyed, so he ends up closing the door and going to bed. However, fast forward to maybe a few hours later, might have been around 7 in the morning, they heard the knock again, and this time they looked, but they couldn't find anyone. They obviously didn't see anyone out there, and this was starting to make Thomas feel annoyed. His girlfriend suggests getting a security camera, so that's what Thomas did. Fast forward to Saturday night, it was around 11 p.m., and Thomas and his girlfriend decided to go to bed early, as they both weren't feeling the greatest, as they both had a really bad day and they just needed a break from everything. However, while they were sleeping, they end up getting a knock on the door, and this time Thomas ends up going down to see it. And before he opens the door, he looks through the peephole and he saw there was someone dressed in an Easter bunny costume. He waved at Thomas, and Thomas was obviously freaked out. Who in the hell would wear a Easter costume in the middle of the night? And why was it going from door to door? It obviously really freaked Thomas out, but he obviously just stared at this bunny, and as it's staring back at him. Of course, Thomas had his first instinct was to call the police, but he didn't want to alert this guy, knowing that he was going to get the cops involved. He didn't open the door, and he stayed there staring at this bunny. It obviously freaked him out, but eventually Thomas turned around to see his girlfriend asking him if he was okay, but when Thomas looked through the peephole again, the bunny was already gone. Obviously, it must have went away when Thomas looked back, but it obviously shows that there was someone really sick and twisted in a bunny costume trying to think of a way to do God knows what to Thomas. Thomas and his girlfriend end up deciding to not answer the door. Instead, they look at their phones from the security camera app. Now, fast forward to maybe around 4 in the morning. That's when Thomas gets a notification on his phone saying there was something moving within the distance of the security camera. Thomas ends up looking, and he sees that it was the same Easter Bunny again. He didn't look at the camera, instead he was just staring at the door. He was just doing a little dance, which kind of freaked Thomas out. Now Thomas wasn't so sure if this guy was drunk or maybe he was just out of his mind, but he was staring right at the door, waiting for someone to open it. Of course, Thomas tells his girlfriend to call the police, and that's when she did. By the time the police arrived, the bunny was already gone, and they said that they would do patrols in the area, and they would let them know if they happened to see that bunny. Obviously, they weren't the only ones who made the call about that Easter bunny. Apparently, a neighbor of Thomas's who lived across the street said that he had been seeing this Easter bunny going from door to door, trying to get people to let him in. Obviously, he sounded very dangerous, as nobody would be in an Easter bunny costume and doing this late at night. So fast forward to around maybe early Easter morning, around 4 a.m., Thomas ends up getting a notification on his phone. Again, this time, he saw that the Easter bunny was staring up at the camera and was waving at him. Now Thomas ends up waking up his girlfriend, and he tells his girlfriend to call the police. His girlfriend did that, and this guy ends up looking and staring at the Easter bunny. As he was staring at the Easter bunny, Thomas was still as stiff as a board. He didn't even know if he should move, go to the door, or do God knows what. He stares directly at the camera, and of course the Easter bunny didn't seem to be doing anything. He then all of a sudden pulls out what appears to be a knife, and he starts trying to bang at the door. This really freaked Thomas out, and he ends up telling his girlfriend to have the police hurry up. Of course, he thought that this Easter bunny was going to break down the door with the bangs. Even though the door was made of steel, he was just concerned that the door was going to give away and the Easter bunny was going to come in. Even what felt like a few minutes turned into maybe 20 minutes. The Easter bunny left the front door. It really freaked Thomas out even more when they saw that the Easter bunny had left. And his girlfriend saw that the Easter bunny was now targeting their back door, which of course they thought that he was gonna break through the glass. Of course, they heard yelling from the neighbor who happened to be out this late at night, saying, "Hey, who the hell are you?" As soon as he said that, the Easter bunny ended up looking over and ends up running off in the distance by jumping over a fence. The police arrived, and they didn't see the Easter bunny, as he had gotten away from crawling over the back door. They end up telling Thomas and his girlfriend that this Easter bunny had been targeting people's houses, trying to get them to open the door to the Easter bunny. Of course, they didn't get an update about the Easter bunny, or whatever the person was caught or not. This was the only time their Easter was horrifying. Nothing like that has ever happened again, but they still wonder what could have happened to them if the Easter bunny had gotten in the house. Was he going to rob them, kidnap them? It was anyone's guess, but nothing like that has ever happened, and Thomas and his girlfriend moved from Utah to somewhere in North Carolina before the COVID pandemic. They always will remember this being the scariest Easter that they ever had. For some context, this was sometime about maybe 2018, and this actually happened to my neighbor who had 2 kids. My neighbor at the time, we'll call her Donna, she had 2 kids. One was 11 and the other one was around 7 years old. They were both really well-behaved young girls, and they never really had anything horrifying happen to them. However, this happened in one Easter when there was an egg hunt held at a location at a park that used to be in the city where I used to grow up at. Now, Donna took her kids there, obviously, because this was an Easter egg hunt for all the kids in the neighborhood, and they were going to have a contest to see who could collect the most eggs. Whoever collected the most eggs would win a prize. Of course, Donna took her girls there, and as they were going around collecting eggs, Donna ends up looking to see that there was a man who happened to be taking pictures. Obviously, he thought that he was taking pictures of his kids, but he didn't seem to be a father of any kind. He was looking around and was giving parents some ugly looks, which obviously sets off red flags. Of course, he was just curious as to what pictures to take, but Donna ended up having a really unsettling feeling. Of course, that's when Donna ends up going to talk to the staff and security and say that there was a man taking pictures of kids and he didn't look like he was a father. The security guard goes up to this man and asks him some questions, but the man eventually started lying. It wasn't until maybe a few minutes later when someone had complained more about this man of what he was doing to one of the kids. It obviously revealed that this man was taking pictures of kids without people's permission or consent. It turns out that he had a collection of CP, which is something illegal. Of course, this man was arrested and he was taken away. It wasn't until a few hours later when the daughters brought it up in the conversation, and Donna said that this man was a wanted sex offender and he had a history of pedophilia. Nothing like that has ever happened again at the egg hunt, but this man was arrested and he was not going to be released anytime soon. All the pictures of the kids' faces and even kids themselves in certain areas where the guy had zoomed in. She obviously hoped that none of her girls were in those pictures, but they didn't get any updates regarding that man. So it's safe to say that he was in prison for a really long time.